But good morning to everybody. Just really excited to be here with an incredible panel. We only have about 40 minutes, and the juice is here, so I'm gonna let them get to squeezing it. But just as a matter of course, we've got a group that represents a number of different perspectives on an issue that has become a foundational issue of our time. I just want to put a bit of perspective on this. I don't have to tell you all this. We just lived through a global pandemic, 3 years being held hostage by a virus, but not just by a virus, by our incapacity to share a narrative about what that virus is, what it was, and how to address it. And in some respects, we can say that science saved us. And then in others, we can also say that our failure to communicate science on its own terms held back that capacity. And today, I want to talk a little bit about not just the conversation that we've had about science, but the conversation we have to have about science. In some respects, science tells us what we ought to do, but we don't really talk as much about how to talk about what we ought to do, about the how and the why of that discussion. So we've got an incredible group of folks. You heard their quick introductions, but I just want to offer a little bit of context for each of them. Dr. Alonzo Plough is with the RWJ Foundation. He has a history as a public health commissioner, which is what my day job is, so if I keep coming to Dr. Plough, it's not biased. And then we have Eileen O'Connor, who has spent a long career in public communications. She's with the Rockefeller Foundation. We've got our Nobel laureate, Professor Paul Romer, who thinks a lot about the way that people coming together changes society through technology, but also through the public conversation we share. We've got Professor Rachel Glennerster. She is a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, who thinks a lot about leveraging the evidence about how we talk about science in public health to help us talk about it better. And then we've got, of course, Commissioner Robert Califf, who leads the Food and Drug Association, and if you haven't heard, they think a lot about public communications about science. So, and then, of course, we've got Professor Sylvie Briand, who is with us from the WHO, and in her role, she thinks quite a bit about public communications on a global scale. So I just want to jump in and just ask a simple question. What has changed? Because I think for a lot of us, pre-pandemic, we had thought that there was a particular script about what we would say and what we would do in the context of pandemic. It turned out that that script was just completely off. And I want to start with you, Commissioner Califf. You think about this in your public work every day. How should we be thinking about public communications vis-a-vis what we've learned in the pandemic? How has it changed the way that you do your job? You've had this job twice, once before the pandemic, once after the pandemic, and just in the spirit of science, that is a very nice case control, N of 1 case control study. So what have you learned in your N of 1 case control study here?
Gee, I was hoping I would learn what to do from these experts, but what I'd say is that the fundamentals of human nature and communication, in my view, haven't changed at all. I actually have slides of there actually were snake oil salesmen in the early days of the FDA who, turns out they were actually selling fish oil, which may not have been so bad after all. But, and people have been susceptible to that sort of chicanery as long as history. What's changed is the ubiquity of communication enabled by the internet. I think that's kind of obvious. So snake oil salesmen of the past would have to advertise in magazines or doctor's offices. Now you have access to billions of people within 10 minutes on the internet who, as the previous panel showed, increasingly an average person couldn't tell the difference between an expert and a non-expert view. So the other thing that's clearly changed, particularly in the US, is confidence in our institutions. So things that we used to take for granted, if the FDA says it, the majority of people will believe it, may not be true at this point. And so for me, it's meant that we have to think about, given our limit, and we have a Congress which in some cases is opposed to us communicating. If you look at the markups of our budget that are happening right now, you'll see very specific prohibitions against communicating. So we have to think about the nugget that we can get out and then how it interacts with what I hope will be a network exemplified by this meeting of people who are dedicating some of their time every day to transmitting reliable, useful information. Because we know that most people make their decisions ultimately on the human interactions that they have.
You mentioned something I think really profound, which is that the challenge of snake oil salesmanship or fish oil salesmanship is not new. And the average age of this panel is probably about 29, but I may have been the only person who grew up with internet in my home as a child. And the thing about that is that it opened the curtain on the conversation that is often shared before unilateral communication happens from some communicator to the public. And that, to me, creates a complexity in the ways that networks are shared and the part of the conversation that the public has felt all of us didn't want you to hear. And in your work, Professor Romer, you've thought a lot about network effects, how it is that groups of people come together to change something. And if you know, it's a social network. Social media is the ultimate network effect, for better or for ill. I'd love to hear your reflections about the nature of social media as you think about it, as either a purveyor, as we heard in the last panel from Tawakkul, as either a purveyor of more information that enables action for good, or its capacity to boil our public conversation down to some odd metric of clout that lives in all of our minds. I'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, one of the most important lessons from economics is that when people come together and pursue self-interest, sometimes that leads to good outcomes in a sense, the so-called invisible hand result, but very often it does not. And so as a society, we need to act through our main mechanism, which is our government, civil society, nonprofits too, but we need to act through our government to structure the collective interactions so we get outcomes that are good, not outcomes that are bad. We need to stop apologizing, like, I'm not a fan of regulation. Regulation is law. It's the only thing that protects us from the abyss. Like banning chlorofluorocarbons, are you against that kind of regulation? We gotta stop thinking of the government as somebody else. It acts for us. We gotta decide what we want. Now, in terms of social media specifically, I think the first question we should ask, because we're scientists, we're not preachers. The first question we should ask is, if the book was good, why has the internet been bad? And I mean that seriously. I think the internet has been bad, but we need to think carefully about what's different about this second form of making communication much, much easier. That's the first thing. Second thing, we need to avoid this temptation to go down the trap of appealing to a notion of good guys and bad guys. It just clouds our thinking. I think the first episode we should really understand about disinformation was the two former FDA employees, Krauss and Gruber, who were authors on the Lancet article which attacked the administration's plan for providing boosters. I think the first question we need to ask about that is, what's our best estimate of how many people they killed? Then when we have an estimate of that number, let's try and ask, what were the incentives that led them to take a position that had no grounding in the science? It was, the article is a mess. It's completely irrational. And what it represents is an illustration of negative attention-getting behavior, which has become very prominent because social media rewards it. And I think it poses a very serious threat to science, the best thing humans have ever done. So, when historians look back, they'll say, well, Babylonian math, yeah, it was there for a while. And then, the scientific revolution, yeah, it had 300 years, but, too bad it fell apart. That's what's at stake right now. And if we can't understand trust and incentives and the mechanisms that help us uncover the truth, we got a more serious problem than global warming on our hands.
I really appreciate that perspective. And Eileen, you've been thinking about public communication for some time. And you're in this interesting perch where not only are you thinking about communication day to day, but you're also in a position to be supporting funding for projects that help us think about it better. If you had to give us some insight about what we need to understand and what needs to be taught to those of us who think about and talk about science, and particularly science that has immediate ramifications for the choices that we make day to day. You know, we could talk about astronomy all day, but very little we do is going to change the course of the stars. It is really fantastically fascinating. But then there's the science of the question of, all right, so I have a decision to make about whether or not I am going to put a chemical in my baby's body. And the implications of that choice are substantially more imminent, but also feel a lot more emotional. So how do you think about both in your day-to-day, how we ought to be communicating, but then also, what do we need to know? What don't we know? What are the gaps in our knowledge about how to do this well?
Well, I think you just hit on something really key in the question, emotional. That is what social media and what Dr. Romer was talking about that's how social media makes money. Their algorithms, we do know a lot about their algorithms actually. We know that their algorithms actually favor emotional, people click on emotion. And mostly we know from psychologists, from researchers, and universities, I'm sure, that are in this audience, that, you know, psychologically, the fear or flight, the fight or flight reflex is very strong. And so what happens is things that create fear, things that create us and them issues, and emotion is what people will click on. The algorithms then favor that. That information is going to get in front of more and more eyeballs, and that is going to then become believed, because propaganda, we also know, the more you say it, the more people that will ultimately think it's true, because more and more people are saying it. Social media is also putting people, and the algorithms are, in information silos. And that also makes them more tribal, which also makes them actually, and the research shows this, even if they are confronted and highly educated, they will actually use and pick facts that will actually agree with the more emotional argument or support that emotional argument. So what happened in COVID? We realized that this kind of information ecosystem kills people. It was killing people. We worked very closely, the Rockefeller Foundation, with Dr. Romer on trying to get tests to millions of people, because we all know, and you all know as scientists, the data is the way to stop a pandemic. If you have the data, you know who to basically isolate, you know where to put your resources, who really needs ventilators. And then you also know, in terms of vaccination, that we use data to figure out where do we need to get those vaccines the fastest, the quickest, and out there, the vulnerable populations, et cetera. But we had politicians saying the more tests you have, the more cases you have, which is absurd. It's the complete opposite. And, but that was politically motivated. It was emotionally motivated. And unfortunately, it took hold. And the same thing with vaccination. So I think you asked originally, what's changed? What's changed is definitely the ubiquity of communications. What's also changed is the monetization of information, and basically making money off of people's clicks, and making money off of what they see. So I actually think that what we should invest in and have the social media companies do, and part of the regulation, we should be investing in algorithms that advantage facts and dispassionate facts and objective facts over emotion. And if we can do that, then we can have differences over policy, we can have arguments over norms, but you cannot have a normative argument, really a good one, and a good policy argument, unless you agree on the objective facts. So the one thing that we've done, the Rockefeller Foundation, and thankfully Robert Wood Johnson has joined us in this effort, we invested a significant amount of money in the Mercury Project, because we wanted to basically arm public health officials and people in communities with ways to counteract misinformation, ways to figure out how do you influence those influencers inside those communication silos. And we did an equitable vaccination initiative in 5 different cities in the United States, mostly in minority communities, because we understood that there was a lot of fear, legitimately because of history, about taking the vaccination. And so one of the things we did is we really figured out who are those trusted voices within a community. And so what's interesting is the more technical we get with information, the more technology is advanced information, we're finding that actually in some ways you've got to really go down to the local level to actually counteract the misinformation. And so that's what we've been investing in is how do we actually, and so the Mercury Project has been funding researchers all over the world on finding those solutions, those tools that people can get to get people to trust facts. COVID was the beginning. Climate change is something our foundation is totally focusing on now. And we're seeing that this is having huge effects, the misinformation. Melissa referenced it. Fossil fuel companies are spending billions of dollars, at least $3 billion on their advertising, et cetera. And so far, philanthropy is about $125 million on this.
But sorry, let me just pile on here. I think Eileen is exactly right, and we also know a lot more than we're willing to admit. The reason these companies behave the way they do, they try and stir up engagement, they try and stir up anger, they stir up emotion, is because their business model, targeted digital advertising, rewards those activities. If we want to stop this, we need to stop a model where third parties pay to manipulate the information that people see, and go back to the way the market used to work, where people pay for something and then get something in return. We could pass the taxes that just shut this model down, and we need to get serious about that.
I think there are a couple of really great points that you all surfaced. One is the fact that increasingly our public conversation is intermediated by a series of corporations who make a lot of money stealing our eyeball and eardrum time. And our ability to regulate it, unfortunately, sits with a body, as Dr. Caliph ironically brought up. Don't want to kill your budget here. So that may not fully appreciate exactly the point that you made, that this is not the business model of yore, and we really need to be either adjusting the way we think about regulation or coming to grips with what this actually means. The other point that you brought up, which I really appreciated, was the fact that social media has democratized our conversation in a pretty important, but also pretty dangerous way. So one of the interesting features of the public conversation on social media during the pandemic was that you had people who spent their entire lives thinking about pandemic preparedness, who have an MD behind their name or a PhD behind their name. And then you have people who are ankle surgeons in some random town in Florida who also have an MD behind their name. And all of them, right, would take to social media and they would demonstrate the truth of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is this odd relationship between how much you know and how much confidence you have in what you know, where you have this U-shaped curve where you all of a sudden have a ton of confidence the minute you've read an article, and it takes you a long time, right, to recognize that you actually don't know what you're talking about, even if you've gone to medical school and did 1 month of population health. Not that I'm bitter at all. But you know, I want to bring you in here, Dr. Briand. Your work is about thinking about how we talk about this in this new information environment. But what's really fascinating about your role, like when I talk about public health, I'm talking to 1.2 million people or 1.8 million people who live in my county, right? And there is a caliper around the sets of experiences that they might have and a lot that they share. You've got to think about it on a global scale. So how have you thought about the way that the WHO ought to be communicating in this moment? What do you feel like you guys got right, and then what do you feel like you got wrong?
Thanks a lot for the invitation and also for the very important question. And indeed, for us, the pandemic has been very challenging because it's a global world, and as you said, it's a new information ecosystem. And so what we noticed is that now the information spreads faster and further, and really the entire world is interconnected. So it's very difficult to manage information and misinformation in particular in this interconnected world. What we see is that People, especially during epidemics and pandemics, are completely overwhelmed with information. And this overabundance of information, we call it infodemic, because it's very noisy and people don't know who to believe, they are confused, and so ultimately they will make choice and they will go to people or places where they think they will find trusted information. And we need to better understand really how and why people share information, including misinformation. And we are still at the beginning of this understanding in this new information ecosystem. And that's why social science and behavioral science are really useful for that. But what we have noticed is that in this very noisy world, what is really difficult is that when people have question and concern, if they go to trusted sources, and if those trusted sources, such as, for example, public health authorities, are not providing the right information at the right time and in the right format, people then will go to see other sources. And so I think this is why what we learned during this pandemic is what should come first is really listening. We need to listen much more. And I think now the technology that can have a good and bad effect as also, I think we can use also the technology and in particular the artificial intelligence to develop better social listening tools that enable health authorities to know in a real time what are the people question and concern so that they can really answer their question and concern at the right time with the right information. And I think for us, so we have developed a tool like that. It's a social media listening platform that is available in 15 languages and in 35 countries. And it's called EARS, EARS, and you can find it online. And it's a really, it's a start, I think. But with this, we can monitor not only the question of people and their concerns, but also if there are variations between genders and also and between countries, of course. And also we can also monitor the sentiment of people if they are anxious, angry, or happy with the information they receive. So I think we should promote social and behavioral science, but also new tools to understand this new information ecosystem of the 21st century.
I love that. Professor Plough, you come from a background in local public health. You've been somebody who's on the cusp of having to communicate in real time, being exactly one of those folks. Now you're at RWJ and you funded an investment in the Mercury Project. Can you talk a little bit about how that translational information, that translational science almost, of how we talk about what we know could have informed the work that you would have done back when you were a health commissioner?
It could have informed it greatly. I mean, you started this out around what has changed, but I will say what has remained the same. This is a look back from 25 years in public health practice. What has remained the same is that we have a really difficult time sort of when science communication has to go retail, when science hits the streets. We really do not have a way of understanding how to communicate at that level. And I think that this continues. I also think what we've learned, I think in public health practice, and certainly reflected in some of our funding priorities, is that we have to consider the misinformation and the disinformation context as a social determinant of health. And those of you who do this work and are social epidemiologists realize this is as important determinant of health as housing, water, and everything else. And it operates, I'll just keep my epidemiologist hat on, operates in two ways, right? It's both a classic contagion, like an infectious epidemiology, it's viral, but it's also a chronic thing, like toxic exposure. And you see both of those chronic and acute aspects of disinformation happening at the same time. We are funding, co-funders of this project, a lot of other work. You heard Kathleen Hall-Jamieson's presentation yesterday. We're a great, important funder of her work, and she's actually working with her colleagues on what does it mean to do predictive models and systems interventions to think about misinformation and disinformation as a social determinant. But I learned a lot actually during the pandemic in some of the public communication we were doing. My boss, our CEO, Rich Besser, did a great job with Wolf Blitzer and that audience. I worked the other shift with Fox, local Fox affiliates and talk radio in the Midwest and the South. And that's where I learned where we have to look at both this sort of acute problem that was happening with misinformation around COVID and this broader context of disinformation about many, many other things that had eroded trust and fragmented people. And listening to that and trying to use my science, but also my person hat to try to communicate effectively in those environments. I think that's the challenge we have. And I think that came out in the opening remarks as well, that we have to understand how we can articulate our science in a way that is more deeply understood and in a way that respects the complementary knowledge of communities.
I really appreciate that. One of the hard parts about academic training generally is that you're taught to ask what we don't know. And so there's a lot of admiration for the problem in most academic institutions. And we're less interested in what we know because, of course, that's not the next research question. And so what tends to happen is we're taught to talk about what we don't know in glowing, admirable detail. And what we know is like, yeah, we already know that. It's not interesting. Except for that's kind of what matters. And Professor Glennerster, you're taking that and thankfully flipping it back on its head. You've done some really interesting work in Burkina Faso. I'd love for you to share that.
Great, thank you, and thanks everyone. And I want to say I'm a grantee of the Mercury Project, so thank you to the funders too. So yeah, I want to start by just saying there's a lot of science on how to communicate science. Right? We, as economists, we run a lot, and other social scientists, we run a lot of randomized controlled trials where we provide information in one way to some people and another way to other people, and we observe who changes their behavior. And the work that I've been doing in West Africa draws on that huge body of science on how to communicate information and what leads to changes in behavior. So what do we know? What have we learned through that long history? Well, we've learned that you want to provide information that fills information gaps. That sounds obvious, but actually a lot of public health campaigns don't do that. They don't first ask, what do people not know? What do they want to know? And it's great to hear the WHO is working on that. We know that information should be actionable. It should be information you can actually respond to. I was in Sierra Leone in the Ebola epidemic when the emergency was proclaimed, and there was the WHO, I'm afraid, in that time, the information coming out was terrible. It missed everything we know about how to provide information. And it didn't tell people how to prevent getting Ebola. That's what people wanted to know about. We know that you need it from a trusted source. People have said that. And entertainment and humor and emotion can make you more likely to believe something. So what we did is we worked with Development Media International, a media company that draws on the science of information to design a campaign, a radio campaign about family planning, which is an area that has long had misinformation way before COVID. People were worrying about that you would become infertile if you used family planning. So they produced this campaign based on the science of how to persuade people. And we randomized by radio station. Some radio stations got the campaign, some didn't. And we also provided radios to women who didn't have radios, and we randomized that. So we had two entirely independent sources of information about whether this campaign was working. And what we found was when you base the campaign on the science, we had very big changes in people's understanding of contraception. It was able to change people's views about this misinformation that had been in these communities for a long time. Those actually changed, and women who didn't want to get pregnant started using contraception. So I'm here to provide the hope in the panel that we can shift these behaviors and shift this these views of these long-held misperceptions about science, but we have to follow the science of how to convey science.
Can I just add on to that? One of the things that we focused in on the Mercury Project when we wanted to fund a project like this was to say there is a lot of research already. And so please, let's do things that we can apply and apply quickly. Because I agree with Sanjay, time is running out. Artificial intelligence and deep fakes are already here. And we have to figure out what is it that we want as societies. And I think these businesses have to also look down the road and say, what is it that they want in societies? We're working on climate change as well. We get from business that investments in, energy transition or other things that, it doesn't fit our risk matrix. And I keep saying, this is a unique situation. You have a freight train coming at you. You don't have the time to de-risk this. You gotta do it, because the risk that we don't do something now is that your investments won't exist, we won't exist. And I think the issue is that the businesses that Paul talks about and Dr. Romer talks about is that the businesses, we have to all as a society take collective action, and he's talked about this, to figure out what is it that we want at the end of the day. And those businesses have to join us. Do we want a free society? Do we want a free market? Because right now, this information system is destroying both of those things.
I really appreciate that point. And one of the pieces that's implicit in what both of you just shared is about trust. And I want to turn to you, Dr. Califf, because you work for the government and you regulate big pharma. You sit between two sets of institutions that don't have much trust. And I want to ask you, what does it take to actually build public trust? Because I find myself in a lot of situations critiquing the pharmaceutical industry, justifiably so. And then a lot of the audience that I talk to will say, well, how can you trust big pharma when they're the ones making these vaccines? And it's interesting because trust gets flattened. There's no nuance on social media. It's like bad or good versus, well, this part of it I appreciate, this part of it I don't. I would say that we don't have enough vaccines. That's really the issue. So how do you think about trust in your role, and what would it take to rebuild that from where you sit? When you think about the next moment you're out of your role, what would it take to really make that investment to get trust to a level where the next time something like this happens, we've softened the ground for the kind of message about mass vaccination?
Oh boy. Well, first of all, I feel like in this discussion, I need to acknowledge that between my two FDA stints, I worked at Alphabet. And so I feel like I have a very deep understanding of much of what you all are talking about. And these entities, which we regard as good or bad, I appreciate Professor Romer's comment about it's not just good guys and bad guys. All these companies are full of really good people who are working in a machine which is producing the wrong outcome. And it's very hard to change. So, I'm very serious when I say the first principle is if you want to be trusted, act trustworthy. But beyond that, I really seriously believe it's beyond the point where government alone can build trust in government. It's got to be people that are scientists, clinicians, academicians. If they don't spend part of their day every day working on this building trust as a community of where expertise is valued and information that's reliable is promoted, I don't see a way out of the box. If you just look at the amount of money we have for communication at the FDA, it's up against this thing that you all have described and that I've lived in. It's so much bigger than we are. It's going to take. And so I'm glad, probably the most important thing, I hope meetings like this actually lead to action in a reasonable period of time.
If I could just jump in on this community point, it's so important it starts there, because much of what the disinformation and misinformation has done has eroded even the problem of difficulty of trust in certain historically marginalized communities who have a lot of historical reasons not to be trustful. When you take that and you amplify it with targeted to those communities, misinformation and disinformation, which is exactly what happened with COVID, you just exacerbate an already bad situation, which makes it even worse in terms of the basic lack of trust in the community and the trust of the institutions. I'll just speak from the public health side. So what we're funding a lot of work that's trying to do that deeper, consistent community connection. Because I just know this as a former public health practitioner. You just cannot drop in with your data in the midst of an outbreak and then say, trust me, because we're here now. There has got to have been other kinds of sustained engagement, or it's not going to work as well. And so I think that community up component of building trust and I would say another iteration of how we think about the public communication of science is needed.
Professor Romer, I see you there. Before you comment, I want to ask you also, I'd love to hear your perspective on the way AI is going to complement this or complicate this. We're in a situation now where all of these language learning models, they learn on everything that's been said, correct or not correct.
Right.
And the level of information that is now going to be AI-generated information off of old, potentially incorrect information is pretty mind-boggling when you think about it. So please.
So first, AI. I've used OpenAI's tools for coding. It's available through GitHub. It's called CoPilot. It's crap. Why is there so much buzz about crap? Ask yourself, do you believe Sam Altman? Do you trust what Sam Altman says, the head of OpenAI? If you do, look at how Sam described the glitch where they had a problem with their software and disclosed a bunch of identifying personal information. Look at how dishonest his answer was about what caused that glitch. And then decide, do I really want to pay attention to somebody who's revealed that he's not committed to integrity and honesty? Then extrapolate from that. We can only trust people. You can't trust code, you can't trust organizations. It's the only object of trust is people. One of the problems in this digital world is we do not know who the people are on the other side. There's no way for somebody like me to actually prove to you that it's me giving a message. They're going to put this on, you're going to probably put this on on YouTube. You're obviously on Twitter. I don't think you should be on either, but you'll put it on YouTube. Listen, you could manipulate this video and have me saying Twitter is great. The software exists to do all of this stuff. So how are you going to know if you're watching the video of what I say here if it was actually what I said? We have a really serious problem, and AI is just going to generate a whole bunch of stuff where we don't know who is behind it. Who's the person? Can I trust them? What we need to address is this fundamental piece of infrastructure of digital authenticity. How do I know who's the person who's behind this? This is a solved problem in cryptography. There's a system called digital signatures, but we just haven't taken the trouble to implement it. And we need to focus on that and make that possible. And I think this is critical for protecting science because it's our individual reputations and our deep concern that we don't want to be revealed as somebody who's not reliable that makes us better than we are. We try really hard to tell the truth and not make mistakes because our reputation matters. You can't have reputations if you don't know who's feeding you stuff.
I really appreciate that, and let it be known that Nobel laureate Paul Romer pulls no punches. So with that, I'm getting the red light here, and it's ferociously counting down against me. One of the things
Can I just say one other thing? Sorry, but listen, there's nobody else right now who's not afraid of Sam. Sam's too rich, he's too powerful, and so nobody in the tech world is going to say his answer about their problem was just completely dishonest. So we as in the scientific community are unusual because we can actually speak up, and we need to do it, and we need to talk about. We shouldn't be on Twitter. We need to talk about people who are being dishonest. We need to talk about fraud.
So
As
I
long
need
as
to
we're
hear what
throwing
you say.
out
Go ahead.
taunts, let me just say one thing real quick. If you ask me who's most delinquent right now, who ought to be speaking up more and have more courage, it's universities and academic centers. They're very privileged. They ought to be on top of this. And I've been told a half a dozen times in the last 24 hours by faculty that they've been told not to talk about things because it would affect the bottom line of the university because of boards of trustees. And this is a very privileged position. If these people don't have courage, I just argue we're in big trouble.
On that note, I'm so sorry. I really do have to bring us to a close. These are really, really important points, and I do hope that every single one of you will find these folks because I know they've got so much more to pour in. I want to focus on one last point to leave you with. The point of universities and colleges. We teach science, but we don't teach scientists how to communicate. And the hard part about that is I host a podcast called America Dissected. We did a season, and then the pandemic hit, and so we extended to talk about the pandemic. And then the question happened, do we keep this podcast going? And the insight was, well, now we're not talking about the pandemic because the pandemic's not gaining the amount of attention that we'd like it to, so we should probably shut it down. Here's the problem. If we are not consistently teaching science and teaching scientists to teach science to the broader public, we will find ourselves back in this situation. What I love about this panel is that they are committed to that fundamental science communication. The last point I'll leave you with is this. It's not enough to say your truth. In a world where eyeballs and eardrums are the most precious commodity being traded every single day, you've got to attract them. So all of us got to figure out how to be really great content creators. I hate to say that. I know Paul's about to punch me in the face. But we've got to figure out how to say what we say interestingly and compellingly because there is somebody, right, who's got what they're saying interestingly and compellingly, and if we can't win them over because we have not thought about it.
Just sign it and put your name,
Yes, digital signature all over it. Anyway, with that, thank you all so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
That's important.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.